So, we're in 2024, and if you're planning on buying anything to do astrophotography, so taking pictures of stars, and more specifically in our case, we'll look mostly at pictures of deep sky objects, like nebulae, the Great Orion Nebula, like galaxies, the Andromeda Galaxy, all of those kinds of really fun stuff to image. You can get great results even in very light polluted cities. I do my astrophotography from here, my rooftop balcony in Tokyo, Japan, one of the most light polluted cities in the world, and I can still get great results. But if you're just getting started or you're planning on buying a new rig, you might get confused about what is available for you to use and buy to get into the hobby. There have been a lot of changes in the last couple of years in the hobby. There have been the emergence of, on my left, smart telescopes that can be a real decent gateway to astrophotography and can take very good photos of their own. You also have the advent of this kind of stuff here, this square here, or this little cylinder there, which are called strain wave gear mounts that have changed the way that you can use your telescopes to track the stars in the sky as they are moving, at least relatively to our point of view, because the Earth is rotating. And so in this video, I want to give you an idea of all of the rigs that are available to a beginner, from the simplest one, like having a simple DSLR or mirrorless camera with a lens on a tripod, or even simpler than that, just a smartphone, to the slightly more advanced ones with smart telescopes, to the even more advanced ones with like a small refracting telescope, astrophotography camera, mount and tripod, to the getting really there kind of stuff with here I have a reflector Newtonian telescope, a large mount to keep track of the stars, astrophotography camera, guide camera, focuser, and then computer to control everything. And there is one misconception that I often see when I make those videos, and a lot of people think that beginner equals don't have a budget. But that's not always the case. That's why I want to go through the range of what is available so you can make the best decision for you, your conditions, and your budget. Because there is a saying in this hobby, which is buy once, cry once. In that it is generally accepted that if you get hooked and you start with cheap equipment, you'll end up discarding that cheap equipment in favor of something more expensive. So the theory goes that if you had bought the expensive thing in the first place, you would have spent less money overall. How true that is, it depends on each situation, but it is something to keep in mind. So anyway, let's get to it. First, let me give you a little overview of the challenges that you will be facing in astrophotography. There are multiple challenges. I would say the two biggest ones are, one, light pollution. A lot of us are in cities. Again, I'm in Tokyo here, so we have to face and deal with a lot of light pollution. And there are ways to get around this. I'll go into some of them in the video. And then we also have to deal, and this is the case for every single amateur astrophotographer, you have to deal with the fact that from our point of view, throughout the night, the stars move across the sky. And even if to us it doesn't look like they move a lot, whenever you put any sort of magnification, so a camera lens or a telescope into the equation, then those stars in the field of view of your telescope or your camera, they look like they're moving around at a completely crazy speed. And so we need ways to keep track of that or to take into account that movement. And keeping track of that movement extremely precisely has been one of the bane of astrophotographies since time immemorial. And most of the time, we'll be using these kind of things here, those mounts that have been set up in a specific way that by rotating in one direction, they're able to keep track to counter the rotation of the Earth. Okay, so with that in mind, how can you start with astrophotography? The easiest way, as I mentioned, is probably using your smartphone. A lot of smartphones these days have tools to let you take like pictures of the stars. The Google Pixel series is very well known for that. And it basically can be put on a tripod, like a specific tripod for smartphones. You point it at where you want to take a picture of the sky, and then the Google Pixel will take like 5 minutes to take a lot of images of the sky. And once it's done, because each image was so short, it doesn't show any star trailing. The stars haven't moved during the exposure. But what it can do is it can use the stars in each of the images that it took use them as reference point to align all of those images together, and then it can take the average of all of the images. Basically, it's called stacking, when you put like one image on top of the other, on top of the other, on top of the other, etc. When you do that, you get more signal and you get better signal to noise ratio, so you get a better image in the end, and that's what those smartphones can do. And it can be extremely rewarding, actually, especially if you're not in a light polluted area. So I used one of the Pixel smartphones when I was like hiking in the mountains in the north of Tokyo, and I got some really cool results with just that, and it was a lot of fun, and it's kind of like fully automated. But obviously that only scratches the itch, and it's not enough. So there are other ways to get started with equipment that you may already have. The most obvious one is something like this, where you have a single tripod and a camera is on top of the tripod. We don't have anything else, no tracker, no nothing, just the tripod and the camera together with a lens. And I've typically used in my time Canon cameras, Canon DSLRs mostly, together with lenses like the Rokinon, or sometimes it's branded Samyang 135mm f2 lens, which is a great lens for astrophotography. And also I've used the Canon 200mm f2.8 lens that's also referenced in the hobby. Of course, there's 300mm f2.8, but that gets extremely expensive. If you already have a camera and lenses, particularly prime lenses that get a much better image quality, then you can already get started, and there are ways to take images of some of the bright astrophotography targets, like the Andromeda Galaxy, like the Orion Nebula, or like there's an area that is around the North Star, Polaris, that is full of space dust that is normally really difficult to take, but because it's so close to Polaris, you don't need to care too much about the stars trailing or moving in your shots. And I have a friend and a fellow YouTuber, Nico Carver from Nebula Photos, that has in-depth tutorials on how to do astrophotography with just a camera and lens. And I'll put the links to those videos down in the description. He has tutorials for, I believe, Orion, for Andromeda, and also for this, the Polaris flare, that area of nebulosity that I just mentioned. And those are amazing. You can get incredible pictures with this relatively simple, and if you already own such a DSLR, cheap equipment. One of the big advantages of this, by the way, is that you can also buy used stuff, right? So used lenses, they can be really cheap. If you find a used lens that is good optically, but like the autofocus no longer works, or the image stabilization no longer works, that's actually jackpot, because we don't need those features for us at all. It just lets us get a really cheap lens that we can then use with our camera for astrophotography. Oh, and I mentioned, by the way, that you should prefer prime lenses, meaning lenses with a static focal length. And this is because star fields are actually the ultimate test of your optics. They are extremely difficult to get pinpoint stars across the field of view, but that is desirable for our hobby. And zoom lenses typically have trouble with that, and that's why I recommend prime lenses, so fixed focal length lenses like the Rokinon 135mm or the Canon 200mm that I've mentioned. And this is something that is going to haunt us also with the hobby, which is every telescope that I have here is made to have a decent field of view with relatively sharp stars throughout the field of view, and that costs actually a lot of money to be able to do that. One of the other things that you will struggle with when you're using a lens like this, or if you use a telescope like this or that without an automated focusing mechanism, is getting the perfect focus on those stars. Effectively, when the stars are out of focus, they look like just discs, basically, in a lot of telescope designs. Sometimes they also look like donuts. That would be the case for this particular telescope. And the goal is to get them as pinpoint, as small and tight as possible with just our eyes, and sometimes only the preview screen of the DSLR, for instance. It's almost impossible. So we need to use other tools to do focusing for us. And when you're using a setup like this one of the easiest tools is something like this. This is called a Bahtinov mask, and it will give you a very simple way to do visually focusing. You can set it up on your lens, and then the stars, when they're in focus, they'll have a really nice called a Bahtinov pattern that you'll be able to use to get perfect focus. And that's one way to deal with this. The Bahtinov mask that I'm using here, by the way, it is built by and sold by my friend called Lucomatico from the Lucomatico YouTube channel. It's kind of a universal Bahtinov mask. It will work with this telescope, with that telescope, with this lens, etc. It is adjustable, super convenient, and I highly recommend it. I'll have all of the links, of course, down in the description. There's another issue, by the way, yes, because astrophotography is a litany of issues that we have to surmount and then to pat ourselves on the shoulder for having worked around those issues successfully. That's what makes the hobby so rewarding. And this issue is that the focus point of your lens or telescope will change throughout the night as the temperature drops during the night. So the glass elements of your lens here will cool down. When they cool down, they deform one slight tiny bit, but even a few microns is enough to put your stars slightly out of focus. So you'll want to refocus periodically if you're doing like imaging throughout the night. So that is the easiest way to really get started. And then once you have this, you can add more stuff to the setup. You could add, for instance, a tracking mount. A tracking mount is something like this that you can align with the north or south celestial pole. So for me in the northern hemisphere, it would be roughly the star Polaris. And then the tracker will just rotate to counter the Earth's rotation. It doesn't do anything else, and it's very convenient, and there are multiple trackers that are available. There is the Skywatcher Star Adventurer tracker. There is the Move, Shoot, Move tracker. There is a tracker from Vixen. There are tons of trackers that are available. I'll have a few links in the description, and what the big advantage of those trackers together with this is that you'll be able to take long exposures of your targets. With just this, you're restricted to short exposures because the stars move so quickly in your field of view. With a tracker, then you can take 30 seconds long exposure, 60-second long exposure, 180 seconds long exposure, and that helps with the imaging quite a lot. So that's, if you've started with this, the next natural evolution is to add a tracker to the setup. The only problem when you're starting with this, including with a tracker, is that you have to find the targets yourself. You have to point the camera at the right area of the sky yourself. And that is often easier said than done. It can be extremely complex, especially for fainter targets. You have to get familiar with the stars. You have to know where you are pointed. You have to do slow, small movements with your tripod, with your tracker, etc. It can be extremely annoying to find targets. And if you find that you are annoyed at finding targets, instead of a star tracker, or after you've bought a star tracker, you can go with something like this, which is a tracking mount. It acts as a tracker. It has the same like rotation as a tracker, but it also has a second axis, that thing at the top here, that can move as well. And because of that, this mount and that mount as well, they implement a capability called as Goto capability. It will automatically move to the area of the sky that you want to image, so you don't need to do that yourself. If you pair that with a control center, like a mini PC here, or like this little control center here that I'll get back to later in this video, it will actually also take images of the sky, analyze the stars in there, and decide like, oh, I'm not pointed exactly at the target, and then just like point itself better, kind of like iterative pointing. It's almost magical, and the technical term for that is called plate solving, by the way, just in case if you see that term while you are getting into the hobby. So that is one route to enter the hobby. Start with the DSLR, the lens, then you can add a tracker. If the tracker is not enough for you and you have trouble finding your targets, instead you can add a mount like this one. You could even evolve from this setup here to that setup there. It's a natural evolution where you'll be, replacing your lens with a refracting telescope, then replacing your DSLR camera with a specialized astrophotography camera. And I'll get to that in a moment. Now, looking at this route, another question that you may have, I've already mentioned trackers, is what mount should you buy? I've already mentioned trackers, but if you want to go to the fully automated kind of go-to side of things, and you want to evolve this rig into that rig in the long term, what mount should you be getting? What mount with go-to capability should you be getting? And that's been one of the big innovations in the hobby, because you have traditional mounts that rely a lot of the time on a system called the worm gear type of thing. And those mounts, they require counterweights, but they also come at very cheap prices. One of the cheapest mounts that you could get for this setup and also for that setup here would be the Skywatcher Star Adventurer GTI. And it's a good mount. It can have some frustration. It will only support small payloads, so small telescopes, small camera lenses, that kind of stuff, but it can work very well. That said, if you want to do the buy once, cry once philosophy, these days we have mounts that are based on a different technology called strain wave gear, sometimes called harmonic drives, and this is something like this or something like that here. And those mounts, despite not having any counterweight, this thing here can carry something like 13 kilograms, I don't remember exactly, of payload. It's completely insane. That thing, without any counterweight, can carry 15 kilograms of payload. If you add a counterweight, you get 20. And they're both tracking quite well, and you can get excellent results with those. The problem is, this mount here is one of the cheapest strain wave gear mounts. It's called the UMI 17 Lite from Proxy Sky. I've made a review of it on the channel. I have a link down in the description, up above as well. And it costs, I believe, 1,200 something US dollars. Not cheap. This one here is more advanced and it costs 2,000 US dollars. Yeah, not cheap at all. So you can see that we are indeed getting into budget issues. But as I mentioned at the start of the video, beginner in the hobby, especially if you adhere to the buy once, cry once philosophy, does not necessarily mean that you are on a budget. So if you're going buy once, cry once, then you can totally go with the Proxy Sky, or here is the ZW AM5N mount, which is excellent. I've also reviewed it on the channel. I'll put all of the links again in the description. And this is something that if you buy it, you can use it with the DSLR, you can use it with the small refractor, you will be able to use it with the large telescope as well. And to some extent, it is true for this one as well. And those strain wave gear mounts, they are an absolute game changer in my book because, in my opinion, going from years and years of using traditional mechanic mounts to those strain wave gear mounts, those things have been much easier to deal with, so much more reliable, and I get great results every time. They also work great when there's quite a bit of wind. They're a complete game changer, and that's what is one of the big new things in 2024. When you're buying a mount, I would strongly suggest, even if it's expensive, considering one of the strain wave gear mounts. Okay, but there's another way that you can get into the hobby, and that is using what I have behind me here. Those are smart telescopes. So these things here are telescopes that are completely all-in-one. They have a tracking mount. You can see if I take this telescope, I can move it around and it will move itself around without any problems like that. It acts as a Goto Mount. It will find the targets, it will center the targets. It has an integrated camera. It has an integrated focuser. The black one has integrated light pollution filters. This one can take light pollution filters as an input at the front of the telescope. And they are both controlled via smartphone apps. They can do everything. They can take great images. And those two are the small ones. They are large ones like the Celestron Origin that costs around 5,000 US dollars. The black one is roughly 500 US dollars. So it's a relatively speaking cheap way of getting into the hobby. This white one is around 1,700 US dollars if I remember correctly. And then you have large ones like the Celestron Origin telescope they're all smart telescopes. They all have the same capabilities, and that last one costs I think 4,000, 5,000 US dollars. It gets really expensive. Again, I'll have all of the links in the description. But the big advantage of those is that it is turnkey. You turn it on, you open up the smartphone app, and you just, the telescope will have suggestions of targets that you can image. It will tell you like, oh yeah, today M42, the Orion Nebula is great for you. So you just tap on it, it will slew itself to the Orion Nebula and can start taking images of it. And on the app, it will automatically stack all of those images and give you a better and better image as light accumulates effectively. It's completely amazing. I've done a review of the C-Star S50, and how it works and my first time using it, and it's honestly amazing what it can do. I'll put the link down in the description again. And I am currently reviewing the Vespera 2, and it's also pretty impressive what it can do. The main disadvantage of those telescopes is that you have kind of less control over the whole flow, and because of the mounts, the way that they track of the stars, they will suffer from something that is called field rotation. So you'll lose a little bit of the field of view that you were supposed to have when you're taking your target. It's not a huge deal, but it is there. But with both of those telescopes, if you're not satisfied with what you get in the smartphone app, they can actually save the raw image file, so the raw output from the sensor that is within the telescopes, so that you can do your own processing of the images. You can take each of the individual frames, raw data, stack them yourself using free software, and then process them yourself using free software, and you can get amazing results like that, truly like almost on par with much more expensive rigs like this one. I mean, $500 for this, you can get great images. I actually have a tutorial on how to do the manual processing if you can go further. Just a smart telescope like that, because it's so easy to set up, it's so easy to just get outside and use immediately with no issues, and then it can also give you the ability to do advanced stuff with it. It's honestly an amazing value and a great way to get into the hobby. And that's also what's new in like 2023, 2024, is how good those smart telescopes have gone and how much they allow you to get manual control as well. So that's why I'm mentioning that. It's a really large advantage these days, and that is one of the routes to get into astrophotography. The disadvantage of this route is that you can't really do the buy once, cry once type of deal, because it's fully integrated. You cannot reuse any of the components in there. Whereas if I started with this and I bought a mount for it, I could reuse the mount when I upgrade to this, and I could use the camera for a while until I upgrade to an astrophotography camera. So this one is all in one, but the road ends with the telescope effectively. Once you want to go into real astrophotography, you will need to buy kind of from scratch different stuff. Okay, so now we can get into like the more traditional astrophotography rigs, what most beginners end up getting, whether it's early or late, to this point here. Where we have here, this is the Quintessential Beginner Astrophotography Rig. And here I have, as I mentioned earlier, a strain wave gear type of mount. This little thing here can support 13 kilograms of payload. So effectively, right now I'm using it with a small telescope, but I could totally put this on top as well. Then on top of it, we have this small telescope. This is an ultra popular telescope. It is the Red Cat 51. I'll put again all of the links down in the description. And it has a focal length of 250 millimeters with an aperture of 51 millimeters for a focal ratio of f4.9. And one of the huge advantages that it has for a beginner is that it can get amazing images of deep sky objects. It can be used with small sensors and still have a good field of view, as well as large sensors because it supports up to full frame sensors. And it's a very jack of all trades type of telescope that gets great results. It is, however, not cheap, and there are alternatives from other brands like Astro has released a 55 millimeters aperture telescope that I hope to review in the near future. There are many alternatives, but the gist of it is for a beginner, the typical recommendation is to start with a small refractor like this thing. If you are confident in your ability and you're subscribing to the buy once, cry once philosophy, and you have money, then you can go with larger refractor telescopes. And refractor telescopes, they're basically just like camera lenses, most camera lenses. They're based on just glass optics. There's no mirrors in there, there's nothing like that. It's just a lens, and you can get larger refracting telescopes like 100 millimeters aperture, 107 millimeters aperture. You can get 120 millimeters aperture, 140 millimeters aperture. It gets extremely expensive, extremely heavy, extremely large very quickly. But this little mount there, I would probably be comfortable with up to an aperture of 107 millimeters refracting telescope. And by going with larger refracting telescope, you get more reach into your target. You can zoom in more. your aperture is larger, so it gathers more photon in any given unit of time. And so you can absolutely go down that road. It is to note that the larger the focal length, the more you're zooming in, and therefore the better the tracking of the star movement throughout the night needs to be. But it's actually not really a big problem with those strain wave gear mounts that I have here and there, because they take care of that. They don't seem to care about what telescope you have on top. It can be heavy, don't care. It can have a large focal length, don't care. It works really, really well, assuming you do something that is called guiding, and I'll get to that in a moment. And then with this, I have here a camera. This is a cooled astrophotography camera that also does two other things. It has a guide chip inside, and it also has a control center inside. It can control your whole equipment. This is called the ASI 2600 MC Air, and I have reviewed it on the channel recently. It's quite an amazing little camera, but it is also not cheap. So when you go deeper and deeper into astrophotography, you will start to want cooled astrophotography cameras because they make a lot of things easier. You also get noticeably better results than with something like a DSLR. And there are cheap ones like this one, which is I think $600, $700 US with a small sensor like this inside. So that's from a brand called SV Boni. This is the SV605MC. I've done a review on the channel before. I'll have the links down in the description. And you also have some that are with large sensors inside. And you can see the sensor is large. There's a secondary little sensor at the top. That's a guiding sensor. This is the ZWSI 2600MC dual camera, which I've also reviewed on the channel. It's basically the same thing as this camera here, but minus the control center. And what I really like with this camera as a beginner is that it does pretty much everything, and it removes a lot of headaches that you can run into as a beginner into the hobby. It's not cheap. It's $2,000 US. You add $1,200 US for the mount. You add $800 US for the telescope. You're in a range of $4,000 US for the whole setup. But that is the quintessential buy once, cry once, and then you can upgrade later if you wish to kind of set up. This camera can be reused a lot, and what it does is, one, it takes the images. Two, it performs an operation called guiding, because as we saw, it has a tiny little secondary sensor at the top here. And that secondary sensor is used to take pictures of the target at the same time as the primary sensor. But what it does is that it only looks at the stars in there. And if a star deviates or moves a little bit, it will tell the mount like, hey, the star is deviating, go back on track. And so it's a feedback loop that is constant. Typically every second it will do that to tell the mount like, hey, get back on track. And the mount just executes itself. And because the mount is a strain wave gear mount, it can react extremely quickly. That's also one of the things that is so game-changing with these types of mounts. But at the same time, this is a smart camera in that it has a control center built into the camera that can control the mount. It can control the guide chip inside, and it can control also other equipment like an automated focuser, provided that it is the same brand as the camera, which is ZW. This focuser, for instance, it's an electronic focuser. It's from a small brand called Gemini, and it wouldn't work with it. When you're starting, you don't necessarily need a focuser. The Red Cat 51 has an integrated Bahtinov mask. Remember the mask to do the focus? Otherwise, you can use something like this for any telescope to use it and get the best focus possible. Then you just need to refocus from time to time during the night or just deal with it in post. The smart camera itself, it's controlled via a smartphone app that is extremely capable. You'll be able to choose your target, have the telescope move towards the target, center the target automatically, cool down the camera, start taking guiding exposures with the secondary chip in the camera, guide the target so we have excellent tracking, take the exposures. Let's say you want to take 30 second, 60 second, 180 second exposures. You just tell it to do that and it will do that in a loop. You can even program multiple targets one after another. So in a single night, you could say like, hey, I'll image this target first, like North American Nebula first, then I'll go to the Elephant Trunk Nebula, then I'll go to M27, the Dumbbell Nebula, then I'll go to the Orion Nebula. You know, it's like you can plan a whole night of imaging directly within this, and it's a bit incredible. The drawback is, of course, it's everything in one. So if it breaks, you kind of lose a lot of things at once. And the fact that it will only work with focusers, or also something called filter wheels that are branded ZW. You cannot buy other equipment. So that's one of the drawbacks. You're kind of like locked into their ecosystem. Talking about the cameras, one of the things, if you're beginning the hobby, that you'll see is that there are two types of cameras. There are color cameras with a color sensor, just like your normal daytime photography camera, the one that is on your smartphone, and you have monochrome cameras. Monochrome cameras can give you better image quality, more details. You'll be able to do a thing called narrowband imaging, which is great for light polluted cities like here in Tokyo, more easily than with a color camera, etc., etc. But I would not recommend them for a beginner. I myself have been doing astrophotography for 15 years, something like that. I started with monochrome, moved to color, went back to monochrome, and now I'm back to color, and I don't feel like going back to monochrome. I don't feel the need. So I would recommend starting out and maybe even continuing out afterwards with a camera like this, which is a color camera. It has the guide chip inside, it has the control center inside, and you can still use this setup with filters that we call narrowband filters. Narrowband filters are excellent when you want to take images of emission nebulae like the Orion Nebula, the Elephant Trunk Nebula that I mentioned, the Dumbbell Nebula, and other nebulae like this. And you can take amazing images of those even from very light polluted cities using such filters. Because within this telescope, you can actually put in a filter, or if you're using a setup like this one, or you've bought the right filter drawer for this telescope, you can have a little drawer kind of thing with a filter inside and change the filter whenever you like. And if you're looking for cheap light pollution filters because you're in a light polluted area and you want to take images of emission nebulae, in general, I would recommend using those filters only for emission nebulae. For the rest, you don't need a filter, at least if you're using this camera. But cheap stuff, I would recommend this set here, the Ascar Color Magic C filters. They're decent beginner filters, and the whole set, it's two filters that let you do full narrowband imaging. I have videos review about this on the channel as well. The whole set costs $200 US. If you want better light pollution rejection filters, one very good point to start with would be the SV Boni SV220 filter, which does the same thing as one of those filters here, but better. And it costs around $200 US. And that's one way to get started. So that's, again, the quintessential beginner astrophotography rig. And that would be like, if you have the deep pockets for it, something like this would be my recommendation for a total beginner. Now, if you have a total beginner who also happens to be a complete geek and nerd, tech geek, then you may have like the same kind of setup, but instead of the camera with the smart center inside, you might want to go with a computer. So I have here a tiny computer. This is the Astro PC Pro. You can also buy something off of Amazon, like I recommend a lot, the Melee Quieter Force C from Amazon. And then you have Windows on it. You can run a piece of software that is free called Nina. It will control everything, and it doesn't care about what brand of equipment you have. And so you can buy any camera you like. You can buy a separate guide camera. You can see that here, this blue thing is actually a separate guide camera that I use with my setup. You can buy whatever focus you like. You can buy whatever mount you like. Well, it's also true for this one. This one can support pretty much any mount, but whatever. This is also a possibility using a Windows-based PC, but it is definitely less beginner-friendly. This is more beginner-friendly, but it does lock you into an ecosystem, which can be hard to get out of later on. By the way, I want to talk briefly also about this telescope here and this mount as well. Before that, I want to remind you, if you like this video, go ahead and click that like button. It takes a second. It really helps the channel out. Let me know what you think about this video, about these setups, about how to get started into the hobby. Have you started into the hobby, and what have you bought? Are you considering getting started into the hobby? What are you planning to get? Let us know down in the comments. If you want to support the channel at no cost to you and you're planning on buying anything from Amazon or astrophotography shops like Agena, High Point Scientific, First Light Optics, etc., if you do so after clicking the links that I have down in the description, it will help me out, again, at no cost to you. If you want to help out even more by sponsoring the channel, you can join the channel as a member. That's the join button next to the subscribe button. Or you can join my Patreon. The link is down in the description. You guys, you make the channel possible. You know it. And I cannot thank you enough for your generosity. Oh, and if you're new to the channel, you can consider clicking that subscribe button if you like astrophotography. Okay, so going to this setup here, as I mentioned, it uses a Windows PC. That gets into more advanced territory, but once you get the handle of it, the software inside is very easy to use. It's just the initial setup might be a little bit hard. It uses like a cheap electronic focuser that will let you keep the focus of your equipment perfect throughout the night. It uses a very advanced mount. Like this mount is excellent. I've also reviewed it on the channel, the ZW AM5N, to carry it. And it uses a camera from Toptech. It's one of the cheaper cameras with a small sensor that I really like. And it uses then a guide camera here. It doesn't have the integrated guide chip here. So instead, I have to use a separate camera. And there's a little mirror system inside to get light from the telescope into that camera so we can keep track of stars in it. But you can see things get a bit more advanced when you start doing this. I will say a word about this telescope here. This is the Carbon Star 150 from the brand called Apertura. It's an excellent Newtonian telescope and that lets you go deep. It has a focal length of like 580 millimeters. It lets you go much deeper into your targets than a small refractor like this does. And it also is relatively cheap compared to a refractor with a similar aperture. It's also light, easy to use, but it does require to learn new skills, specifically collimation of optics. Like it has a primary mirror, it has a secondary mirror, and those need to be aligned together very well. They come decently aligned out of factory, but you may have to do adjustments yourself, and that you need to learn something new. So this telescope can work for beginners as well if you want to have more reach into your targets and you're going to use a mount that lets you do that without any trouble, so strain wave gear type of mount, but it can get a bit more complex. This is a permanent setup on my balcony. This is, by the way, a portable setup. I have it on a small light tripod. I can take it anywhere I like. It's very convenient and yeah, very portable, but again, the quintessential beginner rig for someone with deep pockets. If you don't have deep pockets, you can start with a smart telescope like this one. Also very portable. You can take it with you anywhere you like and very powerful in its own right and cheap as well, $500 compared to $4,000. Not quite the same area of price. And of course, as I mentioned, you also have the starting route of using your smartphone, a camera, a DSLR with a lens, and then adding a tracker and then adding a mount to it. And that's basically it for this video. I hope it was useful. It was interesting to see how tech has made things a bit different for the hobby. We have new stuff, the strain wave gears, the smart cameras with integrated guiding chips. We have the smart telescopes that can do everything with very little effort, and then you can do post-processing on them. All of that has changed the ways that you can access this hobby, and I think it's a very positive change, and that's why I wanted to feature it on this channel. So I hope this video has been useful to you. Let me know down in the comments what you plan on buying, if you plan on buying anything, or how you got started in the hobby. Again, if you buy anything from the links that I have in the description, it will help me out at no cost to you. If you want to support the channel more, you can subscribe to the channel, join my Patreon, or join the channel as a member. It really makes a whole world of difference. But more important than all of that, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget, whenever you can, to look up at the stars, and I'll see you next time.